Hello and welcome to the Ripping Pages. This is the podcast where we have a coffee with the world's most interesting writers to inspire your reading and your writing. And it's all crafted and curated by me, Liam Bishop. That is the theme of today's show. It's our 2026 preview, and we're talking craft and curation. I'm joined by two of the most exciting and up-and-coming talents publishing books in the new year. And I'm talking about craft and asking them about how they wrote their books. And then we're talking about curation. I've asked them both to provide me with a book that helped inspire their work as writers. In one book, We're in Pakistan, where a young woman contends with a strange, undefinable illness amidst political tumult. And then in the other book, We're in London, as a young man tries to understand his passionate feelings over one hot summer in a rural boarding school. And that's not even getting to the books that they've asked me to read. Farah Ali is a writer from Pakistan, and her novel, Telegraphy, is her second novel, and it's published by CB Editions. Farah has been anthologized in the Pushcart Prize and is the reviews editor at Wasafiri. And Madeleine Dunnigan is a writer from London. Jean is her first novel, and it's published by Daunt Books. She was a Jill Davis Fellow on the MFA at New York University. She's currently doing a PhD in creative writing. Delighted to have you both here today. Looking for your book stocking fillers, your next big reads of 2026? Look no further. Rippling Pages has you covered. Madeleine, Farah, thank you so much for joining me on the Rippling Pages.
Thank you so much.
Where are you calling from? Where are you coming in from?
Yeah, I'm up in North London.
And I'm East London, so we're different points on the same compass.
Okay, oh, that's a very nice metaphor. But yeah, delighted to have you here. We've got a bit of a background in to your books. Before I get going, remember to like, share, review, tell your friends about the Ripping Pages if you enjoy today's show or any other episode. I'm going to start with you, Farah. Telegraphy, fantastic book, fantastic novel. I've loved reading it. I always read loads for an interview, and I've read loads for this, perhaps more so than ever. I've read your guys' books. I've read them a couple of times, and I've read previous novels, and I've also had to read what you've recommended to me, and we'll come to those soon. But I want to start with you, Farah, if you don't mind. Telegraphy, it's about an illness, and there's pain and ailments suffused through this text. I wonder if you could just start by talking about this illness, but also the main character and the voice of the novel from who speaks about this illness.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, first of all, in conversation with amazing, conversationalists. Yeah, so the main idea of the book always was a person who is unwell, but is not defined in a specific way. And that was always going to be the crux of the book, illness and its manifestations, whether they are as sixth sense or some itch in the system, in one system, whether it's an itch that manifests itself like in an actual way or not. And I was really obsessed also with the idea of how I kept discovering things throughout history which in my head were all connected and made sense, like the story about the king in Egypt. It was fantastic to know that he was so scared of death that he had all these systems in place to defy or to trick death in a way, and he made himself so ill in the end anyway. He couldn't, obviously nobody could escape death. And I still am fascinated by early anatomy discoveries and how they were made. So just like the mind and the body and ways in which it can feel broken or be broken. So some physical things we can see, you can open a body up and you can see how the systems are connected and how a bone is connected to a tendon, for example. But it's impossible to see thoughts connected to things in the body. But in my head, even if you can't see those things, those are still tangible.
Interesting. So there's this idea of pain, there's this idea of illness, bodies, language, and how it's connected. But there is a historical element, and there's a cultural element. And what kind of world then is the narrator living in? And I guess what came first? Did this world come first, or did this illness come first, or these other ideas?
Well, so the narrator came first, whose name is Annie, and her illness came first. But right along with that came the idea of the other character called Adam or Adam, who also had more tangible illnesses, such as his grappling with his epileptic attacks of epilepsy. How to make those two work in the book. There were many, many, many drafts or something before I had to decide, no, it's only going to be from Annie's point of view. But along the way, I also took away all the historical things and then I brought them back because taking away the historical things made me feel a bit ill. So I brought them back into the book. And I figured
Why
I
did
don't
it
have
make you feel ill? That
yeah,
seems...
I did on the advice of somebody. And he said, just like, you know what, I take all that stuff out and make it about Annie and Adam. And I tried that. And I felt really gross about it. So I brought them all back in. But I also I read Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, which is a phenomenal novel. And in it, I learned the phrase after I read the novel, Emerson's transparent eyeball, which is the idea of a narrator knowing things without explaining to the reader how they know those things. So it could be whatever. So I stopped being too bothered about putting other bits of history in the book or other bits not directly connected to Annie's life, but it was always about illness.
You get a sense, you get a sense though of, it's a tumultuous feeling around the book. I mean, it seems related and sometimes unrelated to the illness that Annie has. Is there, and I find it interesting that you said that you felt gross. Well, gross was the word that you said. I don't know if you could just tell me a little bit more then about, was there more of this culture or society within the book? And I guess why, despite the fact that you felt a little bit uncomfortable stripping some of it away, I guess why did you feel uncomfortable? What was it, do you think, that you were losing, but perhaps also gaining from doing that?
That's a good question. So because Annie, the story of her starts in Pakistan, and the person she meets is connected to music. So there was some research involved, obviously, and also remembering things that my parents had told me, what growing up in Pakistan was like in the 60s and 70s, what the music culture was like. But if I took away everything else, which to my mind was very important in the book, then it would have become a book only about, here is what happened in Pakistan in these 3 decades. And I 100 and million% did not want to write that kind of book at all. That wasn't what the story was. And after I had done the experiment of taking out the other bits, I made a note in my notes that what this book was not going to be about. And it was those things. I did not want it to stay geographically stuck in one place. I wanted it to lean into visions and movement, and the fact that movement brings the connections. Movement was the enacting of the connections, I guess.
Yeah.
That in one part there are these seemingly disconnected passages, right? Egypt one moment and somewhere else the next moment.
Yeah, I was going to ask then, is this then when that made way to this more figurative, dreamlike texture of the text?
Yeah.
And why do you think that is?
I also thought a lot about how is the story going to progress? What elements do I want to keep in the story in terms of Annie and Adam, and what they look like toward the end? What is the end like in the book anyway? And it just made the most sense to, or it just felt the right most version that Annie is progressively getting more ill, not toward like immediate death or something. It's not like the last page and she's taking her last gasp or something, but she is experiencing more visions and the fevers are kind of more frequent. And her recording it in a diary was the best form that I had to come to. 100 million drafts, it feels like. There was a version with Annie, and then I was like, but I don't want to delete Adam. So there was a version where there was like a kind of like a his and a hers, and I hated that too. So I was like, no, this has to be only Annie's story.
Yeah, I'm going to come to you in a second, Madeline, because there is, it's hard to this voice. How old would you say Annie is?
Well,
I find it I
when
find it very compelling. She's a very compelling, very compelling voice. But Annie's interesting because there's this sense of knowingness, omniscience or whatever you want to call it. But then there is also these things that she's unaware of. But then there's it. I felt like this sort of gave her an age that that sort of felt beyond her years, and also a sort of naivety. But I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I had never thought about it like that. About, but I think when we enter the book and she's already starting to record it from some point, I imagine her to be maybe definitely in her 40s, I guess. Maybe because that was, when did I start writing the book? Yeah, about 4 years ago. So, sort of.
Because Maddie, you've read Farah's novel, haven't you? Did you
Yeah.
feel anything like that I felt in that respect? Am I wrong? Am I just completely wrong?
Well,
I've
no,
chatted
you're not
happened before.
completely wrong. I think, one of the brilliant things about the book, and particularly the character of Annie, is there is a kind of translucence to her in the same way that she can kind of see beyond into other places. Loved actually the fragments of history in it. And it reminded me very, very lightly of a Matthias Ennar book. I don't know if you've read The Annual Banquet of the Gravediggers Guild,
That's
but
an interesting point.
yeah, it's a novel that is held together by in that novel there are central characters, there's a recurring story and there's a narrative, and yet there are also what he calls songs that he interlaces in the novel that are just fragments of history from that same place and time. So there's a similar thing where, in your novel, Farah, there are these fragments of history that are all connected through illness or through a preoccupation with illness or pathology in some way.
Right.
And I think that, like, what I loved about the novel is you have the logic of the narrative of the, like, what actually has happened to Annie in her life, and then there's a logic outside of that. The novel has its own logic, which is one of illness, and that kind of ties it together.
I like that. Having its own, the thing you're writing has its own logic, its own physics, so it doesn't have to adhere to what, like, black and white, or you can make up your own rules.
Yeah, exactly. And as you read on, they tie together, they make more sense. And I mean, something I thought about with my own novel was also illness, but um, I suppose pathologization and the way illness is conceived of or described. Jean he feels wrong, he feels broken, he feels like he has certain illnesses. And again, it's to do with a time period, in the 70s in the UK. First, it was called word blindness, and then it was called dyslexia. And even then, it was still conceived of as something that was psychological rather than sort of neurological. And people were, you know, told they were stupid and lazy, and then that becomes itself a psychological problem or an emotion, like it interacts with emotion. So I feel like illness, so much of what we now consider medical, had roots in was originally conceived of as spiritual or something wrong with you rather than like in the body. And epilepsy is actually one of those things, really, isn't it? Like people
Definitely.
growing up with it, they were like they were pariahs.
Well, where is? Tell us a bit more then about where Jean is, and who is Jean?
Jean is, so the novel is set in 1976, and it's set in Compton Manor, which is a rural hippie boarding school in Sussex for boys with quote unquote problems. So again, you have this lumping together of the physical, the psychological, the mental. It doesn't go into great detail as to the exact specifics of every boy's problem, but it does say, it's where boys have been sort of sent when there is nowhere else for them to go. So that is like when a society can't really handle them. Jean, our main character, is dyslexic. Probably if he were born today or growing up today, we would call him neurodivergent as well. I think he displays some signs of autism, or he definitely struggles to communicate along established lines with people, and he's pretty violent. And I think later in the book, he has symptoms of mental illness. And it's a broken love story between Jean and another boy. in the school. So like at its heart, I guess it's a queer coming of age story, and it's about what it means to love, but like what it means to love when you feel broken and how to love someone who is broken.
That's incredibly sweet image, and it is an incredibly tender novel, and you've got I really got a sense that you've got to. I mean, as any writer does, but there was a responsibility here to sort of look after this character. But you've also put him in this it's a very different society that he lives in, and there's not definitions, and I think there's a debate to have around definitions of terminology and whether that helps people or not. But you've got to look after him, but there is a word that comes up a lot, and it's strangeness. The question that actually I'm going to ask is why was a boarding school important to put these characters in and Jean in?
I mean, like Farah, I wrote many drafts, and there were many drafts with many different perspectives. Also in the background of the story is his relationship with his mother, Rosa, who's a single mother and an artist and a refugee and very, very lonely. And the way she loves Jean is not the way he needs to be loved. And so in early drafts, you had Rose's perspective, you had Jean's perspective, you had Jean in London, where he was a punk, and you had some really, really bad kind of fancy dress writing, is what I call it, where it's like, and here they are with their Mohicans. And realized I couldn't write about the punk scene without it just being really bad. You had a narrative from someone 40 years later, sort of reflecting on these characters. But you always did have this narrative at school, and why it ended up being the book and so prominent was, I think, as I was writing, I mean, this is my first novel, so I also feel like I was really learning to write with this novel, and I needed to contain the characters really. I needed some limitations, and putting them in the same place created a crucible. It allowed them to really interact with each other, and like on a craft level, it's kind of easier if there are fewer external influences. But the school as well, I wanted it to feel both of its time and completely out of time. And I think that is what is so precious about adolescent love as well. It is completely consuming, and it kind of takes you away from the world in which you live. So the school is kind of a macrocosm of that microcosm relationship.
And what do you think? Thanks, and it is a crucible, and it's very hot and sweaty. It's a very hot, sweaty summer, and you feel it. Okay, we're going to have a quick break on the rippling pages. Do come back because we're going to be talking more to Madeleine and Farah. Hi, folks. How are you doing? I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to do a quick promo for the new Rippling Pages Patreon I set up. So basically, for £4 a month, I wanted to give people some exclusive member benefits. And so if you subscribe, you'll get a shout out from me and the writer at the end of the show. I'll send you a Rippling Pages bookmark. You'll get a monthly specially crafted newsletter which includes a craft tip and writing prompts based on the latest episode. The newsletter will also contain guest announcements, so you'll know who the next guest is before anyone else, and you'll receive this unredacted newsletter before anyone else does. And you can also do this as a gift subscription. So if you know a listener, a Rippling Pages fan, someone else who really enjoys having a coffee with the world's most interesting writers, you can send this as a gift subscription. And all of this, it just helps me with the running of the show. I do all this for love, I do all this for fun. I just love books and reading and meeting writers, and of course meeting you listeners. So why not take a look? There's a link in the show notes. In any case, it is of course just my pleasure to have you here listening. Welcome back to the Rippling Pages. I'm here with Madeleine Dunnigan and Farah Ali. In terms of, you called it a coming of age queer love story, but setting also that kind of story in the school. What were the choices then around those elements?
Obviously, I am not a young queer boy in the 70s, so I did talk to a lot of people for whom that was their experience, but also had been to boarding schools. I think like I mean, I don't think that's so uncommon, really. Like you have a bunch of adolescent boys in the same place. Like things will, for lack of a better word, erupt. It was complicated to balance it because, this is a period, homosexuality has only recently been legalized. And of course, it's an incredibly homophobic society. So I think there's, what I was trying to balance was actually the commonality of it, the commonplace nature of it, particularly in these settings, versus the kind of projected public decency image. And I think that created a kind of interesting, that was interesting. It was like all of these boys were kind of interacting with each other casually, sexually, often, and yet that would never be spoken about publicly or accepted publicly.
Yeah, there's lots of touch. There's constant scenes of touch, and whether that's the rough and tumble of I've played sport at that age, and the locker rooms and the kind of rough and tumble of boys and adolescents, but there is the boundaries. Do you purposely bring these boundaries quite close between intimacy, sexual intimacy, but then also this kind of pally intimacy, as I might call it?
Yeah, I think maybe like I'm like interested in bodies and the way they move through space. And I think when I write about relationships, I'm writing about bodies and I'm writing about the way they interact with each other. And when you're that age, everything is heightened as well. Or if I think about my days now as an adult, I can go for a whole day without talking to someone, without having to interact with someone, unless I go out and actively make that choice, or I want to, or I make the phone call. But as a teenager, particularly if you're in a boarding school, you both experience the world on a heightened level, and you kind of have this like full on like constant sensory stimulation with lessons, with activities, with emotions. Everything is growing within you and growing outside the world. So I wanted to kind of replicate or show give a glimpse into the heightened experience of that, and therefore there is much touch. There's a lot of sensory descriptions. People are kind of experiencing things on a heightened level, and they're also stoned most of the time.
Touche. A question for both of you then. So we've spoken about bodies, we've spoken about illness. They go hand in hand, but there is within both of your narrators a real precociousness, and they're incredibly curious about the world. Is this something that is related to the idea of bodies and illness?
I wanted to say first that when I was reading your book, Maddie, which was like Liam said, the tenderness is so lovely. I was struck by the but Liam approached that question in a different way, and I'm coming at it from a different angle. The containment of that space, the space that you created with these misdiagnosed or undiagnosed or just put together people that troublesome or ill-fitting or uncategorizable people, basically, and how that created this it lent itself to so much amazingness. I don't know if that's the right word, but how did you, I had a question actually, so I'm turning this into a question. So how did you work with that, with the different types of people, because it's a place for boys with problems? And did you have to choose what to focus on in terms of, was it necessary for you to put your attention toward Jean and Tom, and whereas the other characters as well were also troublesome?
I suppose as it became more apparent to me that this was the novel, I renamed it Jean, and I was more and more in this boarding school world. I realized that I needed to develop the other characters around Jean, and something I felt quite conscious of was the balance between, I guess, stereotype and particularity, because of course there is an element of predictability in characters, and some of them are recognizable, but I did work quite hard to kind of craft, even if they maybe appear in only like 2 paragraphs and they have like 4 lines, to try and think particularly who each of these boys were. But what helped with that was thinking of it always through the lens of Jean and always in the relationships between him and a perceived threat of the world. So there is a slight shift in the book where you initially are introduced to Tom, and there are 5 other boys, all the same age. They're all last years. It's a very small school. It's all sort of unconventional hippie methods. And so you meet them through Jean's eyes, and they kind of appear as this popular, rich other that he is not part of because he's on the grant. But later in the novel, there's a slight shift in his perspective where they're having a conversation around a table, and he realizes that actually the things he thought marked him out as an outcast, as other, are not necessarily so different from the other boys, and there are connections between them. Like some of them have single parents or are from immigrant backgrounds or have artistic backgrounds as well. So I think I wanted to use Jean as this lens to both reinforce and then trouble the perceptions he had of the world around him.
Also, back to what Liam had asked us, which was our obsession with illnesses or unwellness, and bodies, but also not leaving our people all lonely. We gave our people some people.
Yeah, I mean, you wanna, if you're gonna spend this much time with someone, I think you want them to be interesting.
Yeah.
Like I'm interested in characters who are also interested in the world, I suppose.
I find it so interesting because I'm someone who's interested in health and bodies, and as I was saying, I work in health research, so I spend a lot of time talking about illness and speaking to people who have illnesses. And I guess with you, Farah, there is a clear, this is about someone who has an illness because you tell us they are. But I wondered, there's a couple of things that I've picked up from you both there, and it's this sense of there being a sort of center that you're trying to hold, and it feels quite fragile. And then there's also this feeling of, and I think, well, this might be a difference actually. I really felt, Farah, that there was something you're trying to say about healing. What does healing then look like for both of your characters, or does it even factor into their narrative? Are we trying to heal, in some form, the characters? I don't know if that's the
Well,
right
I
question,
think
so do.
that's a great question, though. Well, if I think about in the book Annie healing, I would think it's more in terms of coming to terms with how one is, accepting things, which at times would definitely be so hard. Like for Adam, for instance, healing would be good because it seems to be a more direct medicinal route. But accepting also that, coming to terms with the fact that these are not flaws, or these are not inconveniences to people around them, that these are just the extraordinary things sometimes that the body is undergoing. But yeah, I think for Annie, it just really meant completely leaning into her dreams and her thought processes and seeing where they take her, and just she gets all these visions and she's all right with that. She's never questioned the visions, the ones that she gets even from early childhood. And one thing was, I remember Rachel Kushner saying, I read her book, The Flamethrowers, and she was talking in an interview, and somebody asked her about, oh, I forgot, I think the main character is called Reno.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
what's
yeah.
Reno's background? What's Reno's background?
Correct.
Why is she the way she is? And Rachel was like, I don't want to explain why she is the way she is. Why does the background always matter? And I loved that Rachel said that. But also in this book, I I think I'm kind of obsessed always with going into the behind of a person's current situation. So here, Annie's childhood is mentioned, the loss of her mother is mentioned, but also I made sure that Annie says, and she notes that I think something like there was never a time when she didn't have someone around her who didn't want to be her mother, or act like a parent. So it's not like she was unloved or supremely neglected or something in a lot of those ways. But still, there was obviously something. Maybe we can't diagnose what or where or when, but there's also a mention of how her mother or her grandmother had used to do illuminations for manuscripts and developed this thing in her hand, and she went to have it cut out. So there is some history of undiagnosed or unexplained physical, mental troubles or inconveniences to themselves. Maybe sometimes they accept it, sometimes they don't. But when it comes to Annie, maybe I think she just ultimately found peace, I guess. And so it's a question that I when somebody says, "Oh, happiness," but I'm like, "Oh my gosh, no, it's really peace of mind. It trumps happiness by far." Just like not to be worried in the head and not to have anxiety. So I think that's what Annie or Adam would both be after.
Is that the same for Jean, Maddie?
I think, his desire for Tom and his love for Tom is an attempt at healing. Probably always our desire for human connection or our impulse for human connection is a kind of healing, but I don't think Jean is able to reconcile his desires with the demons. And certainly I don't think there's that much healing going on in the novel. And I think it's I suppose something I wanted to think about was its inevitability as a kind of consequence of the time in which they live. Like, could things have been different in a different time? I'd like to think so. But in that particular time, there was a kind of collision of different forces that made things impossible.
I like that sometimes you can't escape the inevitability of the world you've created in the book, in the story, and things will happen to the people in the book, even if it's not amazingly great results or something, great outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it's back to this, there's the logic of the book.
What do you think your novels then say about the world today? You've both chosen to write about, obviously specific characters, but certain ideas in a certain time. Is that something that was in your mind when you were writing this, or not?
Yes, for me, it's very important that it's rooted in this time. Although it's not, it's not particularly at the forefront of the book. I think the undercurrent of the novel, other ways inherited trauma kind of are passed down between people and create maybe a pattern of difficulty and pain. But I think I'm interested in I'm not interested in blaming characters. I'm not interested in Jean's mother is very lonely and she doesn't have like maybe the support needed to mother Jean as a son. But I don't see his difficulties as her fault. I think what it's saying about the time, it's not so much about the time we live in now, but rather it's a kind of this is like the collateral damage of a society that doesn't care, or a society in which there aren't the structures in place or the support in place. But it's not so didactic as that. Like, I feel like if I had to say what it was saying, maybe that's what I would talk about. But yeah, I think it's also about like the irreconcilability of different loves. So the way Jean wants to be loved is not the way his mother can love him, is not the way Tom can love him, is not the way he then loves. It's a kind of, again, it's this idea of inevitability where characters are, that there's going to be collisions between people and characters, but it's not anyone's fault.
Yeah, I love that it's not anyone's fault. That would be, and it's a really complex thing to show in the book. It would be maybe too easy to say, well, A caused B, therefore, and you did that so wonderfully. Well, I know I didn't set my book in those decades with an intent to show anything. I generally, I think I just work kind of backward, like in time, like, okay, this is where Annie's story starts from. And so if this is her current rough decade or whatever, then this is the decade she would have been, you know, this many years old. So yeah, but I think there's always, I mean, in Pakistan, people are always deeply incorrectly fascinated by the wonderful 60s and the wonderful 70s. Well, we had dictatorships all the way, so there's no wonderful. Um, in terms of less polluted, well, yeah, most of the world was less polluted in the 60s and 70s. So, I mean, those are all idiotic things that people get hung up on. But besides that, I think I I wasn't so keen either on showing the blossoming music scene in Pakistan either. But funnily enough, like every time I would do research about whatever, I would find the US very prevalent, like sending singers here, well, to Pakistan, like a lot of cultural exchange, a lot of ease, you know. Yeah, I think the cumulative effect of constant discord in the world, I think it shows up. It could show up a lot in us if maybe we didn't have things to anchor us constantly, you know? Like as we speak right now, there's so much going on literally at this moment. So uh, if we tune into that, we'll go crazy. But we have to not tune into that constantly for preservation purposes. So
Yeah, thanks both of you for articulating that. But there is a sense of fracturedness or fracture, and you're talking, Madeline, within, and you're both talking within relationships, but you're talking within relationships, and that is a very difficult thing to learn as a child, that you can't always be fulfilled. There's not always a container from the people around you, even those closest to you, that they can't fulfill your needs, whether that's love or, and sometimes that can be more damaging than others, you know, damaging relationships. And then, Farah, I get a sense from you, there's a global nature to some of that. Both of your novels, that as you just said, Farah, that as difficult as it is to sort of just, you know, untune yourself from the amount of conflict that's going on. Within both of your main characters, there is a real lesson in how you can approach that, perhaps within your own, you know, local world, your own relationships, perhaps. Is it a form of human nature, of being a human, that we sort of have to carry the sense of fracture, dislocation through our lives, or it's something that we learn? Is it something inherent, or is it not something like that at all?
That's a big question.
Maybe there's a myth, I think, within society that we are whole in some form, that we are, you know, our parents or whoever it is, people can make us feel whole and love. And you said it was you said it, Farah, it was a queer love story about a sort of, I don't think you said doomed, but a broken relationship.
I mean, I've grown up
Are
with
all,
pessimistic parents and a pessimistic family with some you know, troubled family history. So I don't think I grew up with that myth that we were ever whole or could be made.
okay. Okay, maybe we're asking the wrong
I
question.
grew up with the sort of, I don't know, it's not knowledge, it's I think these things are really complicated. And I suppose again what I was saying is that there is a knock-on effect, you know, if a character experiences great loss and pain, they will inflict that on the generation after them, and probably also to strangers and other people. You know, if a character is othered, they will go on to other. And I think that's very dangerous. And I suppose, yeah, again, it's like back to this idea that there is no blame, but there is certainly a kind of pattern of inherited difficulty or fracture. It's a combination of, I think, the stories we grow up with combined with the experiences we have.
Farah?
yeah, I agree. I mean, that's so well said. And also to the point that, you know, how one grows up, has grown up, and mine wasn't like sparkly and whole. So I'm very suspicious of those who are. I'm like, what? What is that? You mean you had no strife? What does that even mean? So the adulthood, is a result of whatever it is. And yeah, I think carrying all sorts of fractures and hoping not to pass on too much of it. But
from your novels, I get a sense that it's okay. It's okay to feel like that. It's okay to be that. And I think that's a hopeful message. And whether the hope's the word that you folks would like to use, but I think I find that an important message because it can feel, especially in the world we live in today, but I think generally, wherever you are in the world, you can feel fractured, multitudinous identities, trying to satisfy different parts of yourselves in different ways. Okay, we're going to have another quick break on the Ripping Pages, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about the books that Madeleine and Farah have asked me to read. Did you know that there's a Rippling Pages bookshop? It's not a real bookshop, it's online, and it's hosted by bookshop.org.uk. So that means that all books from Rippling Pages guests are on there. They're all sourced from indie bookshops. So buying from that bookshop not only supports the bookshops, but it supports me as well because I get a very small commission from any books sold on the Rippling Pages bookshop. If you fancy it, there's a link in the show notes. Okay, let's get back into it. This is the Rippling Pages Christmas and New Year special. Welcome back to the Ripping Pages. We're here with Farah Ali and Madeleine Donegan talking about their novels and some novels that they recommended to me. And I'm going to talk about those right now. So, John McGurn, That They May Face the Rising Sun. Madeleine, you recommended to me that I read that book. Why did you recommend that?
I just think it's one of the most beautiful books ever written. It's an incredibly slow, thoughtful, and poised novel. It's the last novel that John McGahern wrote. It's set in County Leitrim, and it's a couple who have moved into a house there and taken over the farm and set over a year. So something that I love about this novel is the way it handles time and the way it handles human relations, and both of those are evoked through patterning. So you will see there's a lot of repetition in the novel. It's not self-conscious, it's not drawn to it. There are whole conversations that are repeated in the way that that happens in life. The kind of the play and the role play of conversations. Every time main characters pass the lake, a heron rises from it. There's descriptions of the house in the same way, and I found that actually completely revolutionary in that, sitting at my desk and trying to think of like another way to say the sky is blue or the window is big, and actually the power of repetition and the beauty of it. And that is not to say that any of the prose is prosaic or mundane. I'm really, really drawn. I basically love books that describe nature or the sky in a particular way, but also it is very funny and it's very moving the way characters interact and talk and the patter of conversation over seasons.
Yeah, I love that, and I loved it. Thank you for those reasons that you just said. And I never read John McGahern before, and there is the herons just flying across the lake, and if it was signaling something, or it was just literally that's the environment and that's what happens. I also love herons. I walk down the canal near me and I see the heron, and there's one on campus as well, which is very nice. And there's a point in the book, and talking about families and what changes or what might not change in relationships. There's a point where it's between the Shah, which is this very sort of mercurial, sinister sort of character, and Rutledge, and the dialogue's fantastic, isn't it? As you said, there's really funny moments, but it's also one of those novels where the dialogue is what's not said reveals as much as what is said. And there's just a part where they're discussing a few days after Christmas, so we're tying into a theme. The Shah talking about some photos taken of the street, and he said there's it's like old photographs of where they used to live, and he remarks how things have changed quite a lot, from the past. And it says changes, the Shah remarked sternly. And then Rutledge echoed, nothing but change. And it was in that moment where I was like, there's this brilliant sense of how the world does change, but also how it doesn't change. And for you, Farah, I'm not trying to pin these, I'm not trying to create a theme here, but yours is a novel that, you recommended to me, Gerald Murnane, The Plains. And that is a novel that's full of descriptions of the planes, the scenery. Can you explain why you recommended this to me?
Well, so I got the novel because I read about it somewhere. I read what the last line of the novel is. And it seemed so fantastic and bizarre. This documentarian or photographer who turns the lens of the camera onto himself. And then I got the book, and it was this crazy experience of reading it. It this mad landscape. It's not mad because nothing happens, but it's just it's like Maddie, I can't wait to read this book that you recommended. It seems like I know I would love it somehow. And in the plains, the main character, he goes into this place in Australia, and he wants to record the lives of the plainsmen or their landscapes, but it's always about landscape, and it's there's no definition of what's happening really. There's no before and after. There's no, oh, at this point onwards people started behaving like this. They're just, you enter this bizarro situation right away, right off the bat. You just have to understand, okay, this is how things are in this land, in this place. And yeah, there's like minute descriptions of obsession with placing the camera and where he's going. And that's the reason I asked, Liam, that maybe he could read that. But I remember reading Tom McCarthy's Remainder a few years ago, and it also obsessively talks about how this main character who has this crazy accident and he can't remember, then he's paid out like a lot of money by the corporation, and he uses all of it to hire actors and camera people and everything just to enact the moment when it happened. And the book has a lot of repetition in it, but it's just massively, deeply obsessive. So I love it when that's all the book is about, something completely obsessive, just a world of itself.
But well, guys, it has been my absolute pleasure to have you both. Thank you so much. And thank you for giving me some more reading to do. It has been my pleasure, and I'm so excited for your books. Two of the most exciting talents publishing books in the new year. Farah Ali, Telegraphy is published by Charles Boyle Editions, and Jean by Madeleine Dunnigan is published by Dawn Books Publishing. The links to the other books, I will put them in the Rippling Page bookshop, and I'll put them in the show notes. But for now, thank you very much for joining me on the Rippling Pages.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant.
Such a pleasure. And I really enjoyed talking with you, Farah. I found your book brilliant, and it was a real pleasure.
Same with yours, Maddie. I hope we meet in person. This was really cool, Liam. Thank you. I've never talked to someone who's done so much research into works present and past and, connected. So this was really cool, Liam.
And that is it for the Rippling Pages in 2025. Thank you so much for being with me this year on this journey. We have increased the amount of interviews we've done. We've done bonus content. We've done some live episodes. It has been a new bumpy year for the Rippling Pages. And that is going to continue into 2026. This is the podcast where we have a coffee with the world's most interesting writers to inspire your reading and your writing. I'll be crafting and curating more in 2026 of some of the most exciting, upcoming, emergent talent in literature. Until then, have a fantastic Christmas and a happy New Year.